Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. I never really thought about how thin the walls were in this old duplex until the silence became the loudest thing in the house. My neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson who kept mostly to himself, had passed away peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning, and I had watched the paramedics carry his shrouded body out through the front garden. Since then, the right side of the house had been an empty shell, a cold vacuum of space that should have been silent. Yet I found myself sitting on my sofa 3 nights later, staring at the peeling wallpaper because I could distinctly hear the rhythmic, metallic groan of his shower handle being turned. The sound was unmistakable because our plumbing was linked in a way that caused my own pipes to shudder whenever he bathed. And as the hiss of rushing water began to vibrate through the floorboards, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in my chest because I knew for a fact that the landlord had locked that unit up tight. I tried to tell myself it was just air in the lines or perhaps a lingering pressure from the city's main. But then I heard the heavy, wet thud of something hitting the fiberglass tub floor, a sound far too heavy to be a fallen bottle of shampoo. How could someone be in there when I had the only other key to the building's shared basement? And the police had already sealed the front door with yellow tape that remained undisturbed under the porch light. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I pressed my ear against the cold plaster of the shared wall, holding my breath until my lungs burned. From the other side, through the wood and the insulation, I heard the sound of footsteps, but they weren't the shuffling, rhythmic steps of an old man. Instead, they were heavy, barefoot, and deliberate, pacing back and forth in a tight circle just inches from where my head was resting. Why would an intruder break into a dead man's apartment just to take a shower in the dark of night? And why did it feel like they were waiting for me to acknowledge their presence? The water stopped suddenly, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavy and suffocating. And then I heard a sound that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was a low, raspy scratching, right at the baseboard level, as if someone was using a fingernail to pick at the wood, trying to find a gap in the construction. I backed away from the wall, my eyes darting to the shadows in the corner of my living room, realizing that these old Victorian houses were never truly separate, as they shared crawl spaces and attic vents that were never properly sealed during the conversion. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, but my hands were shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it when I noticed a dark, wet smudge on the carpet right next to the air vent. It looked like a footprint, but the shape was distorted, as if whoever made it had been dragging their weight in a way that wasn't entirely human. My mind raced through the layout of the house, remembering the small access panel in the back of my bedroom closet that led into the shared wall cavity, a space I hadn't checked since the day I moved in. Is it possible that someone had been living inside the walls while Mr. Henderson was still alive, watching us both through the cracks in the lath and plaster? The scratching sound grew louder, transitioning into a wet, tearing noise, and I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that they weren't just picking at the wood. They were prying the baseboard away from the studs. I retreated into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy iron skillet because it was the only weapon within reach, while my eyes remained fixed on the hallway that led to my bedroom. The house felt different now, no longer a sanctuary but a cage, and every creak of the floorboards felt like a countdown to a confrontation I wasn't prepared for. I wondered if I should run for the front door, but the thought of turning my back on that dark hallway felt like an invitation for whatever was in the walls to lung out and grab me. Then, the power flickered once, twice, and died completely, plunging the duplex into a thick, oppressive darkness that smelled faintly of stagnant water and old earth. In the sudden blackness, the sounds from the other side of the wall stopped, replaced by a rhythmic tapping that seemed to be moving up the wall and across the ceiling joists toward the center of the room. I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, my senses dialed to a breaking point, listening to the sound of something heavy dragging itself through the insulation above my head. "Who's there?" I tried to yell, but my voice came out as a pathetic, dry croak that barely carried past my own lips. There was no answer, only the sound of a single screw falling from the ceiling and bouncing off the linoleum floor with a sharp, metallic ping. They weren't just in the next apartment anymore. They were in the infrastructure of my own home, navigating the narrow gaps with a terrifying familiarity. I realized then that the neighbor hadn't been Mr. Henderson for a long time, and the reason he had become so reclusive was perhaps because he was being hunted in his own home by the same entity now stalking me. The tapping moved toward the kitchen vent, and I saw a glimmer of movement through the slats, a pale, spindly finger reaching through to test the strength of the plastic cover. I didn't wait for it to break through. I bolted for the back door, fumbling with the deadbolt in the dark, while the sound of the vent cover shattering echoed through the kitchen. I could hear them dropping to the floor, a heavy, wet impact followed by the sound of rapid, four-legged scurrying that was far too fast for a person. I burst out into the night air, the cold wind hitting my face like a blessing, and I didn't stop running until I reached the street lamp at the end of the block. I turned back to look at the duplex, and for a split second, I saw a silhouette standing in my kitchen window, perfectly still, watching me with a stillness that was more terrifying than any movement. I called the police from a neighbor's porch, and when they arrived, they found both units empty, but they also found something the landlord had never mentioned. Behind the closet in my bedroom, the access panel had been removed, and inside the wall cavity was a small, makeshift nest made of shredded clothes and old newspapers, along with a collection of photographs that had been taken of me from inside the vents. The intruder had escaped through the basement before the perimeter was set, leaving behind only a trail of damp footprints that led nowhere. I never went back to that house to sleep, not even to pack my things, because the police told me one final detail that still keeps me awake at night. They found that the shower in Mr. Henderson's unit hadn't just been turned on that night. It had been running for weeks, and the drain had been intentionally plugged with hair to ensure the water would eventually rot through the floorboards. Whoever was in there wasn't just hiding. They were slowly dismantling the house around me, waiting for the floor to give way so I would fall right into their arms. The silence of a rural winter night has a way of pressing against the windows like a physical weight, but I had always found comfort in the isolation until my golden retriever, Barnaby, stopped acting like himself. It started around 11 o'clock when the wind died down, leaving the woods behind my house in a state of unnatural stillness that seemed to put every nerve in my body on edge. I was sitting in the living room with a book, trying to ignore the way the shadows danced in the hallway, when I noticed Barnaby wasn't curled up at my feet like he usually was during the late hours. I looked toward the kitchen and saw him standing perfectly still, his hackles raised in a jagged line along his spine, staring intently at the small plastic flap of the doggy door built into the bottom of the mudroom entrance. He wasn't barking or growling, which was far more unsettling, but instead he was emitting a low, vibrating hum from deep in his chest that I could feel through the floorboards. I put my book down, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs, and I whispered his name, but he didn't even twitch an ear in my direction. He was locked onto that small square of plastic, his eyes wide and reflecting the dim amber glow of the oven clock, and for a moment, I felt a wave of irrational cold wash over me. Why would a dog that fears nothing stare at a locked doggy door with such pure, unadulterated terror? I walked toward him, my socks sliding silently on the hardwood, and as I got closer, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching coming from the exterior side of the flap, like someone was gently running a fingernail across the plastic to see if it would give. It was too high up for a raccoon and too deliberate for a stray cat, and as I froze in place, the scratching stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. Through the thin plastic, I heard a soft, wet intake of breath, followed by a voice that was tiny, high-pitched and shivering, whispering the word puppy over and over again. My first instinct was to rush to the door and open it, thinking a lost child had wandered onto my property in the freezing cold, but something stopped me dead in my tracks. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and there were no tire tracks in my driveway, so how could a child be standing on my porch in the middle of a blizzard without a sound? As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, A small, pale hand reached through the doggy door flap, fingers wiggling in the air as if searching for something to grab. The skin was deathly white and covered in a fine layer of gray dust, and the fingernails were jagged and broken, as if they had been used to claw through something hard. Barnaby backed away, his whimper turning into a sharp, panicked yelp, and I realized with a jolt of horror that the hand wasn't just reaching in to pet the dog. The fingers began to feel around the interior frame of the door, searching for the sliding security bolt that I had neglected to engage that evening. "Is someone there?" I finally managed to shout, my voice cracking under the pressure of the silence, but the whispering stopped instantly and the hand retracted into the darkness like a startled snake. I lunged forward to slide the locking panel into place, but before I could reach it, a heavy weight slammed against the main wooden door with such force that the entire frame groaned. It wasn't the child. Someone much larger was standing out there, and they weren't trying to knock, they were trying to break the hinges. I realized then with a sickening clarity that the child was being used as a tool, a small scout sent to bypass the locks that a grown man couldn't reach. I grabbed Barnaby by the collar and dragged him toward the stairs, my mind racing as I heard the sound of glass shattering in the mudroom. They hadn't gone through the doggy door. They had used the distraction to smash the small decorative window at the top of the entrance. I scrambled up to the second floor, my lungs burning, and I locked myself in the master bedroom, shoving my heavy dresser in front of the door while my hands shook so violently I could barely grip the wood. I stayed there, huddled in the dark with my dog, listening to the heavy, slow footsteps of an adult moving through my kitchen, followed by the light pitter-patter running of a child. They were talking to each other in low, muffled tones that I couldn't quite understand, but the sound of laughter, a deep, gravelly chuckle followed by a high-pitched giggle, sent a shiver of pure dread down my spine. They weren't looking for valuables. They were exploring my home like they already owned it, opening drawers and clinking silverware as if they were preparing a meal. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, holding Barnaby's muzzle shut so he wouldn't make a sound, while the footsteps began to ascend the stairs, one heavy thud followed by two light taps. They stopped right outside my bedroom door, and the house fell into a silence so profound I could hear the ticking of the watch on my wrist. Then the doorknob began to turn, slowly and methodically, clicking against the lock with a persistent, rhythmic pressure that felt like it would never end. "We know you're in there, puppy," the child's voice whispered through the wood. But the voice didn't sound like a child's anymore. It sounded like a mockery of one, distorted and cruel. I grabbed my phone and dialed the emergency services, whispering my address into the receiver while the person on the other side of the door began to shoulder the weight of the dresser. The wood groaned and the hinges screamed, and I knew it was only a matter of seconds before they broke through the barrier. I looked toward the window, realizing my only escape was a 20-foot drop onto the frozen lawn. But as the first crack appeared in the bedroom door, I heard the distant, beautiful wail of a police siren cutting through the night. The movement outside the door stopped instantly, followed by the sound of rapid retreating footsteps and the back door slamming open with enough force to echo through the entire house. By the time the deputies arrived and searched the property with their high-powered flashlights, the woods were empty, but they found a small, child-sized winter coat discarded on my porch. When they picked it up, they realized it wasn't a coat at all, but a collection of rags sewn together to look like one, and inside the pockets were several sets of keys belonging to other houses in the county. The police told me I was lucky I didn't open that door because they found a long, rusted crowbar leaning against the siding right next to the doggy door. I moved to an apartment in the city the very next week, somewhere with 3 deadbolts and no ground floor entrances, because I can't shake the image of that small, dusty hand reaching through the flap. Sometimes, when it's very quiet at night, Barnaby still stares at the front door and lets out that same low, vibrating hum, and I find myself checking the locks 5 or 6 times just to be sure. I still wonder who that child was, and if they were even a child at all or just something small and broken being used by a monster to open doors that should have stayed shut. I had lived in this house for 3 years without ever worrying about the security of my garage, but that changed on a Tuesday in November when the rhythmic thud of the heavy door opening woke me up at exactly 2:14 in the morning. I sat bolt upright in bed, my ears ringing in the sudden silence that followed the motorized groan, and I checked my phone only to see a notification from my home security app confirming that the garage door had indeed been triggered manually from the interior wall button. I assumed it was a glitch in the old wiring or perhaps a short circuit caused by the damp autumn air, so I remotely closed it and watched the little icon on my screen turn green, signifying that the house was sealed once again. But the next night, at exactly 2:14 again, I heard that same mechanical whine echoing through the floorboards, a sound so deliberate and punctual that it made the skin on the back of my neck prickle with a sudden, cold instinct that I wasn't alone. I didn't close it from my phone this time. Instead, I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept down the hallway in my socks, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I approached the heavy fire door that led from the kitchen to the garage. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, holding my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, and that was when I heard it. The sound of something heavy and wet sliding slowly across the concrete floor. It wasn't the sound of a person walking, but rather the sound of something being dragged, a slow and agonizing friction that stopped the moment I accidentally let out a soft, shaky exhale. I realized then that the safety sensors at the base of the door were being triggered because something was intentionally lying across the threshold to prevent the door from closing all the way. Why would someone want my garage door to stay open in the middle of the night, and why were they only moving when they thought I was asleep upstairs? I looked at the small gap at the bottom of the fire door and saw a flicker of movement, a thin, dark shadow that darted away from the light of the kitchen stove. I wanted to turn the handle and confront whatever was out there, but a paralyzing wave of common sense washed over me, reminding me that I was a mile from my nearest neighbor and completely isolated in the dark. I retreated to the living room and pulled up my external camera feed on my tablet, but the screen was nothing but static, as if someone had sprayed something over the lens to keep me blind to the driveway. The mystery of the why was replaced by a much more terrifying where, because as I watched the static, I heard the garage door motor laboring again, clicking repeatedly as it tried to shut but failing because the sensor path was still blocked. I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that if the garage was open, the only thing separating me from the intruder was the single deadbolt on the kitchen door, a lock I had never bothered to reinforce. I decided to call the police, but as I reached for the landline, I heard a new sound coming from directly above the kitchen, a soft, rhythmic creaking of the attic joists that ran the entire length of the house. My house was designed with a shared attic space that connected the garage rafters to the main living area, a design flaw I had never considered until I heard the sound of a heavy body shifting its weight over the ceiling tiles. They weren't trying to get into the kitchen. They had already used the open garage to climb into the roof, and now they were moving through the darkness above my head, searching for a way down. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, watching the rectangular attic hatch in the hallway, and I saw the wooden panel vibrate as something pressed down on it from the other side. Whoever was up there was being patient, moving with a calculated slowness that suggested they had done this many times before, perhaps even while I was home during the day. I felt a surge of nausea as I wondered how many nights they had been perched above my bed, watching me sleep through the tiny gaps in the recessed lighting fixtures. The hatch began to slide to the side, revealing a dark, yawning square of shadow, and I saw a pair of boots, filthy, duct-taped and worn, dangle into the hallway air. I didn't wait to see the face of the person attached to them. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks while the sound of the intruder dropping to the floor echoed through the house with a heavy, bone-chilling thud. I burst out into the cold night air and ran for my car, which was parked on the street because the garage was occupied by a nightmare. I locked the car doors and started the engine, my hands shaking so much I could barely turn the key, and I backed away just as the front door of my house swung open. A man stood there in the frame of the porch light, dressed in tattered layers of dark clothing, holding a long, rusted pry bar that he must have taken from my own workbench in the garage. He didn't chase me. He simply stood there and watched me drive away, his face obscured by the brim of a dirty hat, his posture relaxed as if he were the one who belonged there. I drove to the police station in a state of shock, and when they finally searched the house an hour later, the man was gone, but they found something that made the officers go silent. In the far corner of the attic, right above my pillow, they found a small pile of my own mail, a discarded pillow from my guest room, and dozens of empty water bottles that had been moved from my pantry. He had been living in the loop of the garage door for over a week, using the 2:14 a.m. opening as a way to signal someone else or perhaps just to let out the heat from the attic. The most terrifying part wasn't that he was in my house, but that the police found the interior side of my bedroom door had been fitted with a small, discreet latch that could only be operated from the hallway. He wasn't just watching me. He was preparing to lock me in, waiting for the one night I didn't wake up to the sound of the garage door to finalize his plan. I sold the house within a month.